If you're gonna do it, you know what I say. If you're gonna do it, don't throw it away. If you're gonna do it, don't throw it away. I'll be a boy, I'll be a man, I'll be the one who understands. I'll be a first, I'll be a last, I'll be the only one you ask. I'll be a friend, I'll be a toy, I'll be the one who brings you joy. I'll be a...
All right, gang, welcome to War of 1812. War of 1812, which is really kind of the defining event of the Madison presidency. My name is Michael Gillette from Burning Champion High School, and I'm here to present War of 1812 AP U.S. History style. So first, we're going to start off with just a general introduction to the presidency of Mr. Monroe. Monroe, prior to being elected president in 1808, will have served Thomas Jefferson, his mentor, as in the position of Secretary of State. Thomas Jefferson, after 2 terms in office and after really a second term that's mired in a worsening and deepening involvement in the Napoleonic Wars, American involvement into the Napoleonic Wars, he decides to step away after 2 terms, really making him the father of the 2-term presidency, because he was the first to decide that the Washington precedent of only serving 2 terms was to be acknowledged. And so his, despite the widespread disapproval of his embargo policies, Jefferson, upon leaving office, was still extremely popular, and that popularity put him in a position that very few presidents are put in, and that is the position of naming one's own successor. And of course, his choice to succeed him was his fellow Virginian and collaborator, James Madison, arguably one of the most important political philosophers in all of history. But he helps to keep alive what we call the Virginia dynasty. 5 of our first 6 American presidents were from the state of Virginia. And so you will see the continued development of the Virginia dynasty. So from the very beginning, Madison was really mired in this conflict that was passed on to him by his successor, and that is the issue of steering clear out of the Napoleonic Wars. Madison maintained Jefferson's policy of peaceful coercion. Now, when we think of coercion, we're thinking, yes, continuation of an embargo. However, the embargo of 1807 enacted by President Jefferson will be repealed and replaced by the Non-Intercourse Act. Madison will impose the Non-Intercourse Act, trade sanctions against all countries except Britain and France. Also, like the embargo of 1807, a major disappointment and a huge failure. British Prime Minister David Erskine assured Madison's Secretary of State that Britain would, of course, revoke its restrictions in June of 1809. With that assurance, Madison reopened trade with Britain, but Foreign Minister Erskine had acted on his own without consulting the government in London. He was fired, and non-intercourse will resume. And it proved very ineffective as and as it says, with the ineffectiveness of the Non-Intercourse Act, Congress in May of 1810 will reverse ground and adopt what's called Macon's Bill No. 2, which reopened trade with both warring powers, provided if either of these countries dropped their trade restrictions on American commerce, something that also fails. Of course, looming large in the early years of the Madison presidency is going to be the impressment issue. The British, of course, kind of the fallout from the Revolution and the loss of the American Revolution, the British Navy will face severe shortages in filling its naval forces. And so the impressment issue is largely driven by this shortage of sailors in the British Navy. And with its war with France, Britain felt like it had no choice but to impress, and that means force American sailors to enlist in the British Navy in order to fill that shortage. Between 1809 and 1911, or excuse me, 1809 and 1811, there would be over 6,000 impressments of American sailors. Now, obviously, prior to the Madison presidency, what actually inspired the Embargo Act and really got the ball rolling in this gradual escalation to a potential war with Great Britain was the Chesapeake Leopard Affair, often called the Pearl Harbor, the War of 1812. Britain sought fugitive sailors they believed to be on board the American warship, the USS Chesapeake. Fighting broke out whenever the U.S. captain refused British desires to board their ship. Of course, shots were fired. 3 sailors were killed. The British captain boarded the ship and pressed sailors, and this created a war frenzy. Not listening to the war frenzy, Jefferson responded to the Chesapeake Leopard Affair by imposing the Embargo Act. So ultimately, once Bacon's Bill number 2 was signed into law, Napoleon will comply, and Madison will restore trade relations with the French, even though the British continued to seize ships. So the British refused to give in. With more patience, war could have been avoided. Britain, at the last minute, tried to revoke its orders in council, but it too was late. On June 1st, Madison asked for war, and by mid-June, Congress concurred with his demands. So it's interesting to state that in the midst of the conflict here, okay, in the midst of the conflict, okay, that's not what I wanted. Okay, so in the midst of the conflict, the Napoleonic Wars, the French controlled the ports, the continental Europe, the ports of continental Europe. The British controlled the seas, and so ultimately, American neutral trading ships had a very difficult time in conducting commerce with the continent. Both France and Great Britain. Just a simple review here, but France and Great Britain, the British Parliament passed what was called the Orders in Council. Okay, the Orders in Council right here, and the French passed what's called the Berlin Decree. Of course, it was an edict from Napoleon that neutral ships bound for their enemy countries would be boarded, cargoes confiscated. In the case of the British, sailors impressed. So when we look at the major causes, the main causes of the War of 1812, the number one cause, and this is widely consistent among American historians, is that the demand for U.S. neutrality was the major goal of the War of 1812. The fact is that from day one, Britain never treated us as an equal. All we wanted was to be treated as an independent sovereign nation. And that's the one thing that the British government really refused to do after the revolution. So we were really fighting for respect. We were fighting for neutrality, the right to be able to travel freely on the seas without our ships seized, our sailors kidnapped, and the right to enter foreign ports without seizure of American cargoes and other property. Like I said, also we had the British impressment issue. I gave you the numbers earlier. Indian raids on the frontier in 1810. A general Indian uprising erupted in the Ohio River Valley, and it was led by a Shawnee Indian chief who led a confederation of Indian tribes against American settlements in the frontier, and ultimately Tecumseh and his happy band of warriors would be defeated in 1811 at the Battle of Tippecanoe. And of course, the war hero that came out of the Battle of Tippecanoe was future president and frontiersman from Indiana. His name is William Henry Harrison. So Tecumseh was defeated at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and the belief was amongst the Americans that the British were the root cause of the Indian attacks, that the British were inciting and encouraging Indians to attack American settlements all along the frontier. Of course, the British still had refused to have withdrawn from various forts that they had on American soil lingering from the Revolution. And so you really have to place a lot of emphasis on the Indian issue. The Indian issue is a big reason why many politicians ultimately will vote to go to war against Great Britain. Now, just to be fair, there is no history of any link between the British and Canada and the incitement of Indian attacks against Americans in the frontier. There is no evidence of that. But nonetheless, that's what Americans perceive to be happening. Also, another reason for cause of the war would be the rise of this new generation of American leaders. They were, the successors of the Revolutionary generation. This is a group of young, aggressive, nationalistic, patriotic politicians that wanted their own glory over Great Britain. They wanted the same glory over Britain that their fathers and their grandfathers had. So prominent war hawks would be, for example, from Kentucky, Henry Clay, and from South Carolina, John C. Calhoun. Ultimately, why war was fought is because Madison caved in. He caved into the political pressure. The political pressure put on him by the media, by public opinion, by leaders of both parties. Madison ultimately caved into the war cries. He didn't want to be another John Adams. Remember, John Adams lost his job, lost his second term because he wouldn't listen to the war cries. Well, Madison ultimately caves. Another reason for the war, land-hungry Americans saw the war as an opportunity, were really supportive of the efforts to go to war. And the fact is, according to the rule of 1756, the English Parliament, Britain would never trade with neutral countries with the enemy. And so the fact is, they're never going to stop. I mean, as long as Britain is at war with France, they are not going to respect our rights of neutrality under the rule of 1756. So ultimately, Pinckney Treaty was negotiated in order to resolve the impressment issue. This treaty wasn't even ratified by the U.S. Senate. So one reason for the war is that both sides were really unable to resolve the issue of the impressment issue. Ultimately, the war was very divisive. Republicans voted for it. People whose livelihoods depended on farm exports, grain, cotton, tobacco, whose exports were damaged by British trade restrictions, those that wanted more land in Canada and Florida, and of course those that were very angry at the Indian attacks in the frontier. These folks largely came from the South and the West, and they voted Republican. Voting against the war would be your New England Federalists. These are these merchants who, despite the restrictions, are still making profits. And so they feel like a war would greatly harm their business interests. So they oppose the war. Now, the War of 1812, once it got started, it was a war in which the United States was really ill-equipped to fight. James Madison was a tremendous political philosopher, but not a very good commander-in-chief. He gets us involved in a war at a time in which we were really ill-prepared to fight that war. Our militarily, we were ill-prepared, and really for that reason, much of the war was wrought with failure. The United States they attacked Canada only to be repulsed. Washington, D.C. will be burned to the ground by British forces, and Britain nearly conquered 2 large territories in New York and in New England. And so James Madison is really loses a great deal of popularity in large part due to the lack of preparedness of the armed forces prior to declaring war. But despite our lack of unpreparedness, the war was a very small war. Approximately 6,000 Americans will be killed or wounded. But we mostly fought Canadians and rarely fought the British. American victories in the Royal, we see major victories in the Great Lakes, but there's no victory greater than that of the Battle of New Orleans. Battle of New Orleans, which was won after the Treaty of Ghent that ended the war was signed. Of course, losing the Battle of New Orleans would have caused Britain to renege on promises made at Ghent. So the Treaty of the Battle of New Orleans, very important event. It was a key pivotal battle, which really sealed that second victory of the Second War of American Independence. One of the major consequences of the Battle of New Orleans, of course, is it leads to the rise of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson comes out of the war as one of the major national heroes in the country. And so he's General Jackson, who already made a career for himself, a name for himself fighting Indians, saw his legend, his status grow during the War of 1812. War of 1812. It's important to understand that the Treaty of Ghent, really the war ended in a stalemate. Neither side really conquered the other. The treaty just simply halted the war. There's no territorial gains by either country. But ultimately, one of the most important byproducts of the War of 1812 is that it led to improved relations with Great Britain. Great Britain, from this point out, will be great friends to the United States. U.S. industry was stimulated as Americans became less dependent on British products during the war. The war did actually help spawn the Industrial Revolution in America. And so the war also is significant in that it helped produce a tremendous wave of nationalism, and it was a moment of great unity in the country, great unity in the country. But ultimately, let's see. I'm going to pass this. We know that Clay and Calhoun were some of the strongest proponents for war. Daniel Webster of New Hampshire was one of the most outspoken critics of the war. He spoke on behalf of New England Federalists and the manufacturing era. Now, what's important to know is that during the war, the Federalists acted in a fashion close to the point of being disloyal. First of all, let me go ahead and move ahead here. First of all, the Federalists disliked France, and they weren't really bitter towards Britain. So New England really didn't have a beef with Britain, and that's a big reason why they didn't vote for the war. The New England economy is tied to Great Britain, so they believed that a war with Great Britain would harm their economic interests. During the war, New England merchants, Federalist merchants, began to continue to trade with Britain. which gave great aid to the enemy. They opposed the addition of Canada to the Union. We used to fight. The War of 1812 was largely fought by soldiers from the West and from the South. In fact, New England governors refused to release their state militias to help fight in the war. They gave food and powder to Canada, so they actually gave more support to the Redcoats than they did the Americans during the war. New England investors ultimately had more investments in Britain than in America. So they really, the New England merchants, the Federalists, they really hitched their wagons to Great Britain. And so therefore, during the war, they were quite partial to England. But of course, then you have the Hartford Convention. And so the Hartford Convention met in December through January of 1814, prior to the end of the war. And it was a convention of Federalists leaders who sought to try to address the grievances they had relating to the war and to seek compensation for wartime losses, because they felt like the war had a negative impact on their economy. The radicals within the convention were successful in getting the convention to vote on a plank to secede from the Union. And even though it failed, it did a great deal of damage to the party. The convention also offered 4 amendments to the Constitution: one to abolish the Three-Fifths Compromise, one to require a 2/3 vote for an embargo and admission of a new state, or a declaration of war. And then 2/3 is very, very difficult to achieve. Ultimately, these four amendments are designed to limit the Republican Party, the Jeffersonians. They called for term limits on the president, and ultimately sought to make it to where presidents, we could not have presidents from consecutive presidents from the same state. So, and like I said, they denied naturalized citizens the right to hold office, which anti-immigrant plank. They offered these amendments into Congress the day that the word in Washington, D.C., the day that word came in of General Jackson's victory at New Orleans, and it had a devastating impact on the party, and ultimately behavior during the war, if you read down here, disgraced the Federalists and resulted in their elimination as a major national political force. So, yeah. So the War of 1812 it's important. It's like I said, it was a small war, United States versus Canada. It was it was a war in which the Federalists sought to undermine the war effort, and for that reason, they will die as a party. They will die as a party. By 1820, there will be no more Federalist Party. The war did promote the careers of future presidents Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison. Considered one of the most patriotic events in U.S. history because of the fact, because of the fact of the amount of nationalistic feelings that it provoked. I mean, it created more nationalism than did the Revolution. So obviously, we look back at the War of 1812 as a very intensely patriotic event. Of course, our national anthem, Star Spangled Banner, comes from this war. So, like I said, it killed the Federalist Party. It united the country. It reduced sectionalism between the North and the South, and it ushered in what is called the era of good. Of course, will be the topic of the next unit. We won the Revolution for good. It was the Second War of American Independence, and one of the greatest things we get from the War of 1812 is neutrality and the status, and respect as an independent nation. As a result of the war, Great Britain becomes an ally for good, and there will be no more hostilities. U.S. industry will be stimulated by the war in order for wartime production, and British-backed Indians forever lose foreign support. So the war turns out really bad for those Indians that sided with, let's see, Sorry about that. So, very good. All right. Of course, when we get to the next unit, we will spend time really analyzing the impact of the War of 1812 on the United States, on our foreign policy, economic policy, and of course, in terms of political history, we'll look at the decline of the Federalist Party and the triumph of the Republicans. So anyway, this is our last thing to do. So that being said, I appreciate your attention, and I wish for every one of you a great day. Thank you. Bye.